If teenage me was a victim of anything, I was a victim of trying to fit in. Perhaps that's why Tumblr's collective users have such an obsession with the term fandom, and why that notion of a fandom is so funny to me. I could see a younger me endlessly reblogging inane fandom stuff for hours on end at a website designed around echo chambers. But let me give you a reason as to why being part of something isn't all that great, and why I'm glad I'm my own person. Let me set the stage. I was a 17-year-old virgin that had never hit on a girl. I regularly hung out at school after hours in the science room with the rest of the rejects that populated the science club. The girls there were indeed rejects in the traditional sense, but nonetheless, quite a few of them were rather attractive and exactly my type. Still, they were way out of my league. There was Laura Dupart, this tall, lanky girl with an ill-fitting pixie cut, an angular face, milky skin, and a rather outgoing personality. Laura wasn't a fitting name for her. You would know what I mean if you saw her. She had beaten every Pokemon, Metroid, Zelda, and Castlevania game to date. I hadn't, but I wish I had. There was Zoe Coulter, an unnatural redhead with a sickly frame and a preference for clothes you'd see a woman in her 50s wearing. She was regularly in the hospital for one reason or another. Still, when we had dance parties, she'd dance her heart out. I hadn't, but I wish I had. There was Alex Vance, a chubby black girl with braided pigtails befitting of a 7-year-old girl, dimples evocative of whirlpools, and a crippling lack of confidence. There were two Alexes, and she demanded to be called Black Alex, despite both Alexes being black and the other one being a boy. She regularly opined the beauty of every other girl around her. I hadn't, but I wish I had. I wish I had beaten those games. I wish I had danced more in my youth. I wish more than anything that I would have told those girls how I felt. If not for myself, for their confidence. But I didn't. How could I possibly understand the nature of my adolescent flaws while suffering them? Well, I can think of one way: having someone explain them to me, who is less fearful and bleak in their lens on reality. There was also Vicky D'Amico. Vicky wasn't a member of the science club, and for the longest time I hadn't even spoke to her. She was a reject as well, but a Hollywood reject. Her flaws, although numerous, weren't in physical attributes. She was a punk. Long, raven black hair, matte black lipstick, black leather clothes, black. As black as the black described in her black poetry in her black notebook. Black. And a silver tongue piercing. I was naive if you hadn't guessed, but I still knew what that meant. So, how did I end up around Vicky, and why is she important to this story, and by proxy to you? I called my gym teacher a, quote, fucking moron for believing in creationism. This landed me in detention with one other student. It was a hot, humid day. The kind of day that's fine if you're outside in the wind, but gross and sticky if you're in. The room was a surreal southern orange from the intense light of the almost setting sun. When I got up from my seat to open a window for a breeze, the gym teacher, who was on detention duty that day, lucky me, told me to sit down. When just a moment later he was pulled away from his duty by a phone call, I opened the window anyway. He wouldn't notice. He was, may I reiterate, a fucking moron, and I stand by that. Vicky took this time to compliment me on my bold insult. We got to talking, and she took quite the shine to me for no real reason. She invited me to come with her and some friends to see Lever Action Lawsuit. I said, Lever Action Lawsuit? To which she said, Lever Action Lawsuit, in her best impression of a spaz. She explained that they were a surfer punk band with a cult following. All four of them would go on stage dressed in all-black business suits and sunglasses, with slick-back black hair and Winchester rifles. The image I got in my head was cool, but in an over-the-top action movie kind of way, if you know what I mean. They always peppered the crowd with Winchester bullets by tossing a briefcase full of loose ammo off stage. They also always had their instrument cases on stage and only played in rural areas. I, of course, had no knowledge of the band, but I instantly wanted to know more, both out of genuine curiosity and because Vicky was taking quite the liking to me. She was laying it on thick. Yet I couldn't grasp that she liked me for the dumbest reason imaginable, for something I did that was out of character for me. You might not think this applies to you, but it does. Don't you worry. The fucking moron returned, and I called him a fucking moron, leaving the detention room. My parents loved that action, but the school only called them, offering no further punishment. I picked up Vicky and her friends, Matt Packard, a girl named Tara whose last name I can't remember for the life of me, and one Philip Dials, who everyone just called Dials, and by everyone I mean the people in the car. We ventured out to some venue I can't recall the name of. It was a place that billed itself as the historic something or another, despite it only being around about 20 years. Anyway, the place shut down not long after. That said, it was a great place to get booze if you were underage and had a decent beard. But I was driving, and I only had the ability to grow mild peach fuzz. Vicky was hanging on me and sipping booze from her pocket stash. It wasn't real affection, but it felt real. Didn't stop me from feeling as though there was something off. It wasn't just that everyone was dressed in black and I wasn't, or that my id was fighting my superego, or even that the show was supposed to have started 45 minutes earlier. It was a subtle chill that ran along the current of the light evening shower outside. Have you ever watched those TV shows where they get people to talk about their experiences with being abducted by aliens? They show blurry images of UFOs and aliens backed by a bright light and eerie music. They have this irresistible force to them. The images of the aliens, that is. The people that produce and edit those shows are very convincing in explaining the feeling of being caught in a tractor beam. The feeling that you're basically putty in the hands of a being way more intelligent than you are. I mention these shows because that's how I was feeling in my head, on my goosebumps. I got this claustrophobic feeling like I couldn't leave, and if I went outside I'd have to pay to get back in and it'd look weird, so I was trapped with this quiet riot intensifying in my mind. Then light grazed my vision coming from the stage, a light that seared my retina. The crowd didn't start applauding, but rather their bodies started shaking like a mosh pit. I dropped to the floor as to avoid the light, and they yelled. Boy, did they yell. I opened my eyes just enough to observe the moshing turning into a rhythmic shaking. It was organized. It was entirely too organized. I felt like I needed help, so I tugged on Vicky's leather sleeve the way a child tugs on a mother's arm. She wasn't paying any attention to me. Like a dog in the presence of bacon, she paid no mind to anything but the stage. I tugged, and eventually I stumbled further down to the sticky floor from my already low position, taking Vicky with me. When she was on the floor with me, she looked down at the floor bewildered. She said, "This is weird." I remember it vividly. For a moment, I couldn't comment, like certain functions of my mind just didn't connect. She said, "This is weird," again, but with more panic in her tone. I said, "Yeah," a handful of times in a row, like, yeah. Ugh. We should go. We started to crawl out of the venue, then ran hand in hand, and I didn't look back at the stage, but Vicky did, and I know exactly when she did, because it was like pulling dead weight for a moment. Instinctively, I knew something was wrong, and so I damn near yanked her arm out of her socket, which seemed to work in getting her to follow. Outside of the venue, we should have been able to hear the music. We should have been able to hear this surfer punk stuff I had never heard of. But it was silent. Just the sound of the spring evening. Vicky said we should go back in for the others, but I could tell from her tone that she didn't mean it. I could tell that she knew something was wrong with whatever was going on there. I asked if it was like this the last time she saw them, which was when the confession came out. The confession was that she had never seen them live, only heard about them, and upon pressing the issue, I found out that she hadn't even heard a single one of their songs. I took a timid stand and said, "I'm leaving, you can come with me if you want." Reluctantly, she followed and buckled up. On went the engine, but I was just as reluctant to leave as she was to follow me to the car. At first, I thought it was that I didn't want to leave those other kids, but thinking back on it, not to be callous, I didn't care. I didn't have any empathy for them. It was like I wanted to know if Vicky actually hadn't been to a Lever Action Lawsuit concert, or if she just forgot. If she really hadn't heard any of their songs. But I knew I couldn't get any real information from her. I'd have to see firsthand, but even then, I know that wouldn't work. I wanted to know if there was a band and music. I wasn't sure why, but I got out of the car, still running, and went up to a streetlight which had a poster for the band. Vicky yelled at me to come back. I think she was worried I was about to go into the venue. And I'm glad she did yell, because at that point, on that night, I wasn't sure if my actions were my own. We finally took off and drove into a random residential area that I had never been to before, just clearing my head. Back when gas wasn't absurd. Anyway, for a good while, we didn't say anything to each other. Vicky just eyeballed that poster with a yellow and black image of 4 men in business suits, and I let the road relax me. I finally asked Vicky what was on stage. She just said 4 men in business suits. She didn't say Lever Action Lawsuit. She said 4 men in business suits. Like it was unexpected to her. Then I asked if she had a CD or an EP of the band, and she said she didn't remember. Then I asked where she heard about the band, and she said she didn't remember. She said it with a quivering voice, knowing full well how frustrating it was for me to hear those answers, and knowing something was very wrong with her memory and actions. I could see an expression of fear that kept me from yelling, "What the fuck do you remember, Vicky?" at the top of my lungs. I was lost for a long time before we started talking, and I had been driving for over an hour, and the venue was a good 30 minutes from home the other direction. The suburban area we passed through gave way to another rural area. I was certain I was out of Lake County by now. This might seem paranoid, but we found what looked like an abandoned farmhouse and parked the car in the adjacent barn. We closed the barn door and slept there. It was a night we just wanted to escape. We were woken by what was initially an angry man who owned the land. I don't think the excuse we gave, we had a long night, would have worked normally for what we did, but when he saw Vicky's face, he knew that it was true, and that what we were doing didn't involve barn sex or alcohol. The man was kind enough to let us use his phone, give us directions, and even gave us some extra gas because we didn't have enough to get back. Before we went on our way, he did ask if we were some of those anarchists. I said, "I'm certainly not, sir," and Vicky quickly chimed in, "Me neither." I asked why. He said something to the effect of they were a rotten bunch or something. "I understand counterculture and youth and whatnot, but stay clear of them anarchists and you'll do fine." Maybe I'm remembering it wrong, but I think that's what he said. My parents weren't mad at me for staying out with no word. They were just glad I was safe. Vicky was picked up from my house, and her parents were mad, and they had a bunch of questions I wasn't privy to at the time. When it was all said and done, we found out that Matt, Tara, and Phil killed a family in their sleep with Winchesters. The head of the household was a preacher and an anti-war protester. That church was devastated by the loss and temporarily shut down until they got a new owner who didn't engage in any sort of controversial protesting. That drove away pew sitters. Matt, Tara, and Phil were labeled anarchist terrorists by the news, and perhaps they were. I'm not really sure. The police found him in a barn, asleep, in possession of 4 Winchester rifles before the sun even rose, thanks to an anonymous tip. I'm not sure what any of this means, but I know I was lucky to not be part of that fan base. And I don't know what happened to the poster in the car.